Why the Vikings were the most dangerous warriors in history. You are standing at the edge of the world, you know. The morning is calm, almost too calm. A thin mist hangs over the sea, and the only sound is the slow rhythm of water touching the shore. Nothing feels wrong, nothing warns you. Then someone notices it. Dark shapes, far away, barely visible through the fog. At first they look like drifting shadows, harmless, distant, but they are moving, not randomly, but with purpose. And as the light slowly breaks through the mist, those shadows begin to take form. Long, narrow silhouettes cutting through the water with unnatural speed. Ships, not trading vessels, not familiar sails, something else. The horizon is no longer empty. It is advancing. A strange silence falls over everyone watching. No one speaks, but something deep inside begins to tighten. An instinct, a warning older than reason itself, because whatever is coming does not belong to your world. And then you see them, figures standing aboard those ships, still, watching, waiting. They are not rushing, they are not signaling. They already know something you do not. By the time the first horn echoes across the water, it is too late to prepare, too late to understand, too late to run. This is not the beginning of a battle. This is the moment your world stops being safe, and the question that will haunt every coastline for centuries is already forming. Who are they? And why does it feel like they cannot be stopped? The world before the Vikings. Before those ships ever appeared on the horizon, the world believed it understood how danger moved. War was not random. It had direction, intention, and above all, warning. Kingdoms clashed, but they did so within a framework that people had learned to read. Messengers carried threats, scouts reported movements, and armies gathered in ways that could be seen long before they arrived. Even fear had a pattern. You knew where it came from, and in some way, you believed you could prepare for it. Life in early medieval Europe was fragile, but it was not chaotic. Villages were built where the land allowed survival, close to rivers, fields, and trade routes. People woke each day with the quiet understanding that the world, while dangerous, was at least predictable. The church stood as a pillar of stability, monasteries rising like islands of peace in a landscape that often trembled with conflict. These were places untouched by violence, protected not by walls, but by belief. No army would waste time attacking what had no strategic value, or so they thought. War itself followed a rhythm that felt almost natural. Rival lords disputed land, kings expanded borders. Battles were fought on open ground where strength could be measured, and outcomes, while uncertain, still made sense. You could lose a battle and understand why. You could win and believe you had secured peace, at least for a time. There was a logic to it, a structure that gave even the most brutal conflicts a kind of order. But that order depended on something no one questioned: the idea that threats would come from where they always had. From across a border, from a neighboring power, from someone with a claim, a grievance, or a visible ambition. Every defense, every strategy, every expectation was built around that assumption. It was not just a military belief, it was a way of seeing the world. And because of that, an entire civilization developed a blind spot. The sea was not feared. It was respected, even avoided, but never seen as a pathway for invasion. It was too vast, too unpredictable, too disconnected from the daily concerns of land-based life. Coastal settlements existed, of course, but they were not fortified against sudden assault. They were open, exposed, trusting in the distance that separated them from unknown threats. What danger could possibly come from beyond that endless horizon? That question was never truly answered, because it was never seriously asked. So people lived as they always had. They worked the land, prayed in stone halls, traded along familiar routes, and trusted that the systems around them would hold. That if danger came, it would come in a form they recognized. something they could name, understand, and face. But beneath that quiet certainty was a fragile truth. All of it depended on predictability, on the belief that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to prepare for it, that enemies would behave like enemies always had. And the moment that belief was broken, everything else would follow. Because what happens when the threat does not send a message? When it does not march across land but rises suddenly from the sea? When it does not seek territory but something far more immediate, far more devastating? In that moment, knowledge becomes useless, experience becomes irrelevant, and the systems built to protect begin to collapse under a kind of pressure they were never designed to withstand. That was the world before the Vikings, a world that believed it understood danger, a world that believed it had time to react, a world that was about to discover what it meant to be completely unprepared, born in a land that forged survivors. Long before their ships cut through foreign waters, long before their names became whispers of fear across distant kingdoms, their story began in a place that did not forgive weakness. Scandinavia was not a land that nurtured comfort. It demanded endurance. It tested every breath, every decision, every season. And those who could not adapt simply did not survive. Imagine a world where winter is not a passing inconvenience, but a force that consumes months of your life. The cold is not just temperature, it is pressure. It seeps into the ground, hardens the soil, freezes rivers, and stretches time itself. Food becomes scarce, movement slows, every resource must be calculated, every action deliberate. There is no margin for error. One mistake does not cost comfort. It costs life. In this environment, survival is not taught. It is lived. Children grow up watching the land dictate their limits. They learn early that strength is not optional, that hesitation can be fatal, that the difference between those who endure and those who disappear is often a single decision made at the right moment. Over time, this does something profound to a people. It reshapes how they think, how they act, how they face the unknown. But it was not just the cold that shaped them. The land itself offered little generosity. Arable soil was limited. Harvests were uncertain. Communities could not rely on abundance, only on adaptation. If the land could not provide enough, then survival required looking beyond it. This was not ambition. It was necessity. And necessity creates a different kind of mind. A mind that does not wait for opportunity but goes out to take it. A mind that understands that staying still can be more dangerous than moving forward. A mind that becomes comfortable with risk, because risk is often the only path left. Over generations, this mindset became something deeper than survival. It became identity. To endure hardship was not just expected, it was respected. To take bold action was not reckless, it was admired. Caution, in many ways, became a liability. Because in a world where hesitation could mean starvation or death, boldness was often the safer choice. Now imagine what happens when people shaped by this environment look beyond their shores. They do not see distance as a barrier. They see it as a challenge. They do not see the unknown as something to avoid. They see it as something to confront. Where others would question the risk, they would question the cost of doing nothing. This is where the transformation begins. Because when survival no longer feels like enough, expansion becomes inevitable. And when a people who have been forged by hardship decide to move outward, they do not carry fear with them. They carry something far more dangerous: familiarity with struggle. An understanding that discomfort is temporary, but opportunity, once missed, may never return. So when they stepped onto their ships for the first time, they were not explorers driven by curiosity alone. They were survivors extending the only logic they had ever known. If the land cannot sustain you, you find another. If the world limits you, you push beyond it. And if something stands in your way, you overcome it. What the rest of the world would soon face was not just a group of raiders. It was a people shaped by a land that had already tested them far more harshly than any enemy ever could. They didn't invade. They appeared. There was no warning, no banners on the horizon, no marching armies raising dust across the land, no messengers riding ahead with threats or demands. The world had learned to read the signs of war, but this time, there were no signs to read. One moment, everything was normal. Fishermen pulling in their nets, monks moving silently through stone halls, villagers beginning another day that felt just like the last. Life unfolding in quiet repetition. And then, without explanation, it was broken. Not gradually, not logically, instantly. Ships emerged where there had been nothing. Not approaching in formation, not announcing their presence, but materializing as if they had always been there, hidden just beyond sight. By the time anyone understood what they were seeing, those ships were already close enough to strike. This was not an invasion in the way people understood it. It was an interruption of reality, because invasions could be tracked. Armies needed supply lines, roads, preparation. They left traces. They created time between intention and impact. That time was everything. It allowed fear to spread, but it also allowed defense to form. The Vikings removed that time completely. They did not move slowly toward their targets. They arrived inside them. Imagine the shock of that moment. The mind struggles to process it. There is no transition from safety to danger. No space to prepare mentally or physically. 1 second, you are living your life. The next, you are inside a nightmare that feels unreal, almost impossible to accept. And that hesitation, that brief, paralyzing confusion, was all they needed. Because while others were trying to understand what was happening, the Vikings were already acting. They moved with purpose, with speed, with an intensity that made it clear this was not their first time doing this. Every motion felt practiced, every decision immediate. There was no chaos on their side, only on yours. This is what made them so terrifying. Not just their violence, but the way they controlled the moment. They decided when the encounter began. They decided how long it lasted. And most importantly, they decided when it ended. By the time resistance formed, it was already over. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. No prolonged occupation. No attempt to hold ground. No predictable pattern to follow. Just absence. Silence. Smoke rising from what remained, and questions that no one could answer. Where did they come from? Why here? When will they return? Those questions became more dangerous than the attack itself, because without answers, fear begins to grow in every direction. Every distant shape on the water becomes a threat. Every quiet morning feels like a deception, and over time, something shifts. People stop trusting the world around them. They stop believing in safety, because when an enemy does not arrive, but simply appears, there is nowhere left to feel secure. This was the true beginning of their power, not in the damage they caused, but in the certainty they destroyed. Speed was their deadliest weapon. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. Speed was not just an advantage for the Vikings. It was the foundation of everything they did. It defined how they moved, how they attacked, and how they survived. While the rest of the world relied on preparation, they relied on momentum. And momentum does not wait. Traditional armies were heavy. They required planning, supply lines, coordination. Every movement had to be organized, every step calculated. Even the strongest forces were limited by how fast they could travel, how quickly they could respond. War, as most people knew it, was slow enough to think about. The Vikings erased that slowness. Their ships were not built to impress. They were built to move. Long, narrow, and incredibly light, they cut through the water with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. They could cross open seas, navigate shallow rivers, and land almost anywhere. Beaches, riverbanks, even places no one believed were accessible. There were no safe zones. But speed was not just about their ships. It was about how they thought. Decisions were made instantly. There was no hesitation, no delay. Every action flowed into the next with a rhythm that felt unstoppable. They did not stop to reassess. They did not pause to reconsider. They moved and kept moving. Imagine trying to defend against that. You receive news of an attack, but by the time the message reaches you, the attackers are already gone. You gather your forces, but there is nothing left to confront. You prepare for the next strike, but you do not know where it will happen. You are always behind. And that is exactly where they wanted you. Because speed creates pressure. It forces mistakes. It overwhelms systems that depend on time to function. The faster the Vikings moved, the slower their enemies felt. Reaction turned into hesitation. Hesitation turned into failure. This was not just physical speed. It was strategic acceleration. They compressed time itself, turning what should have been hours or days into moments. Battles did not unfold. They exploded. And before anyone could regain control, it was already over. But there was something even more dangerous hidden within this speed. Control. They chose when to engage and when to disappear. They dictated the pace of every encounter, and when you control the pace, you control the outcome. No matter how strong your enemy is, if they cannot match your speed, they cannot match your power. This is why they were never where you expected them to be. This is why they could strike the same region again and again without being stopped. And this is why fear began to spread faster than their ships ever could. Because people started to understand something deeply unsettling. It was not just that the Vikings were fast. It was that no one else could keep up. The silence before the chaos. It never began with noise. No battle cries, no thunder of marching feet, no warning that something was about to break. What made their arrival truly terrifying was not the chaos they brought, but the silence that came just before it. Imagine standing near the shore at dawn. The air is still, almost heavy. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural, as if the world itself is holding its breath. There is no sign of danger. No movement that demands attention. And yet, something feels wrong. That feeling was the first signal. Because the Vikings understood something others did not. Fear does not begin when the attack starts. It begins in the space before it, in uncertainty, in the quiet moment when the mind senses a threat but cannot yet see it. They did not rush to announce themselves. They approached without disturbance, their ships gliding through water with minimal sound, their presence concealed by distance, fog, or the simple fact that no one expected them to be there. By the time they were visible, they were already close enough to act. And in that brief window, silence became a weapon. People would notice something small, a shape on the horizon, a movement where there should be none. Conversations would slow, eyes would narrow, questions would form, but answers would not come fast enough. And as those seconds passed, tension would begin to build. What is that? Is it nothing, or is it everything? That hesitation created a fracture in the mind, a moment where certainty collapsed and fear began to fill the space. Because when you do not understand what you are seeing, you cannot decide how to respond. And then, just as that tension reached its peak, it broke. The silence ended not gradually, but violently. Horns cutting through the air. The sudden surge of movement. The sound of impact, of shouting, of destruction unfolding all at once. The contrast was overwhelming. One moment, stillness. The next, chaos so intense it felt unreal. This transition was not accidental. It was engineered. By allowing silence to stretch just long enough, they amplified everything that followed. The human mind struggles with sudden change. It cannot shift instantly from calm to crisis without losing clarity. That loss of clarity is where mistakes happen, where resistance weakens, where control disappears. The Vikings did not just attack bodies. They attacked perception. Because once that first moment of confusion took hold, everything else became easier. Decisions slowed, reactions fractured. People moved without coordination, driven more by instinct than by strategy. And against an enemy that was already moving with precision, that imbalance was devastating. Even after they were gone, that silence remained, not physically, but psychologically. Because every quiet morning that followed carried a new weight. Every calm horizon became suspicious. Every moment of peace felt temporary, fragile, ready to be broken again without warning. And that is where their power deepened. Not in the chaos they created, but in the silence they left behind. A silence that no longer felt safe. A silence that made people wait and wonder. When will it happen again? The power of not belonging anywhere. You can defend against an enemy you can locate. You can prepare for a force that has a capital, a border, a place it must return to. Every army in the known world depended on that logic. Kingdoms had centers of power, territories had limits. Even the most dangerous enemies were anchored to something. And because of that, they could be tracked, predicted, and eventually confronted. The Vikings broke that logic completely. They did not belong to a battlefield. They did not belong to a single territory. They did not move like a nation. They moved like a force without a fixed shape, and that made them something far more difficult to fight. Where do you strike back? When there is nowhere specific to strike. Their world was not defined by borders, but by movement. The sea was not a boundary to them. It was a network, a pathway that connected distant lands in ways no one else had mastered. Rivers became extensions of that network, allowing them to move deep inland, far beyond what anyone believed was reachable. They were not tied to one place. They could be everywhere, and more importantly, anywhere. This created a kind of strategic invisibility, not because they were hidden, but because they were untraceable. One day they could strike a coastal village. Days later, they could appear hundreds of miles away, attacking a monastery deep inland. There was no pattern to follow, no central command to target, no predictable route to defend. Every location became vulnerable. Every distance became meaningless. For those trying to resist them, this was paralyzing. Defense depends on focus. You protect what matters most. You reinforce the areas at highest risk. But when risk exists everywhere, defense becomes impossible. Resources spread thin, attention fractures, and the sense of control begins to disappear. Because control requires limits, and the Vikings had none. But this was not just about geography. It was about identity. They were not constrained by the expectations that defined other societies. They did not need to hold land to prove dominance. They did not need to establish permanent control to consider a mission successful. They could take what they wanted and leave. That freedom changed everything. It allowed them to choose their targets without consequence, to engage only when conditions favored them, to disappear the moment resistance became inconvenient. No siege, no prolonged conflict, no unnecessary risk. Just precise, calculated action followed by immediate withdrawal. They were not fighting for territory. They were fighting for advantage. And when you only fight on your own terms, you eliminate most of the weaknesses that others depend on. This is why they could not be contained. Because containment requires boundaries. And boundaries require an enemy that respects them. The Vikings did not. They moved through the world without asking permission, without announcing intention, without leaving behind anything that could be easily followed. And in doing so, they created a new kind of threat, one that could not be surrounded, one that could not be cornered, one that could not be understood using the rules everyone else relied on. And as long as they remained undefined, they remained unstoppable. A culture that rewarded risk over safety. Most societies survive by avoiding danger. They build systems to reduce uncertainty. They teach caution, discipline, restraint. They reward those who preserve stability, who protect what already exists. Over time, this creates order, but it also creates limits. Because when safety becomes the priority, risk becomes something to fear. The Vikings evolved in the opposite direction. In their world, safety was never guaranteed. Stability was fragile. The idea of preserving what you had was often less effective than seeking something better. And when survival depends on pushing beyond limits, the entire culture begins to shift. Risk stops being a threat. It becomes a requirement. From a young age, individuals were shaped by this reality. Not through formal training, but through experience. Every challenge demanded action. Every uncertainty demanded a decision. Waiting was rarely an option. And over time, this created a mindset where hesitation felt more dangerous than boldness. Because in their world, playing safe did not ensure survival. It often ensured failure. This belief transformed how they approached conflict. While others calculated odds, weighed consequences, and waited for favorable conditions, the Vikings were willing to act under uncertainty, not blindly, but decisively. They understood something fundamental, that action creates opportunity, while hesitation allows it to disappear. And in battle, that difference is everything. Imagine facing an enemy who does not pause to reconsider, who does not retreat at the first sign of resistance, who moves forward with a level of commitment that feels absolute. That kind of pressure forces reactions. It disrupts planning. It pushes opponents into defensive patterns they did not intend to adopt. Over time, this creates an imbalance. One side is reacting, the other is dictating. But this mindset went deeper than combat. It shaped how they explored, traded, and expanded. Crossing unknown seas was a risk. Entering foreign lands was a risk. Engaging with unfamiliar cultures was a risk. Yet these were not seen as barriers. They were seen as necessary steps, because the alternative, staying within known limits, offered no growth. And a culture that accepts risk as part of progress becomes difficult to contain. It adapts faster. It recovers quicker. It pushes further. Failure does not stop it. It refines it. This is why the Vikings were not just aggressive. They were persistent. Setbacks did not discourage them. Losses did not define them. Each experience added to a growing understanding of what worked and what did not. And that understanding made each future action more effective. Over time, this created something powerful: confidence. Not the kind built on comfort, but the kind built on exposure to difficulty. The kind that comes from facing uncertainty repeatedly and learning that it can be overcome. That confidence changes how a person moves, how they decide, how they engage with the world. And when an entire group shares that mindset, it becomes more than confidence. It becomes momentum. Because when you are not afraid to take risks, you begin to operate in spaces where others hesitate to enter. You act faster, you commit fully, you push forward when others hold back. And in that gap between hesitation and action, you gain control. This is what made them so dangerous. Not just their willingness to fight, but their willingness to act when others would not. Because in the end, the greatest advantage does not belong to the strongest or the most prepared. It belongs to the one who moves first and does not look back. They turned distance into an advantage. For most of the world, distance was a barrier. It slowed communication, delayed action, and limited ambition. The farther something was, the less control you had over it. Armies struggled to move across large territories. Messages took days or weeks to arrive, and the unknown beyond familiar borders was often left untouched. Distance created safety, but it also created isolation. the Vikings saw something entirely different. Where others saw separation, they saw connection. The sea was not an obstacle to them. It was a pathway, a living network that linked distant lands, rivers, and opportunities into a single fluid map. While kingdoms were confined by land routes and political boundaries, the Vikings moved through a space that had no fixed limits. And that changed everything. Because when you can move freely across vast distances, you gain something most others never will: choice. They could choose where to go, when to strike, and how far to push without being restricted by the expectations that shaped other societies. A target hundreds of miles away was not out of reach. It was simply a matter of direction and timing. And because no one expected them to travel that far, those targets were often completely unprotected. Distance became their shield. The farther they came from, the harder they were to anticipate, the harder they were to track. And once they left, the distance made pursuit almost impossible. By the time any response was organized, they were already beyond reach, moving through waters that others could not navigate with the same precision. This created a powerful imbalance. Their enemies were tied to their own territories, forced to defend what was near, limited by how far they could project power. The Vikings were not. They could extend their influence far beyond what anyone believed was realistic, striking deep into regions that had never prepared for conflict. And when those regions were hit, the shock was overwhelming. Because distance had always meant safety, now it meant vulnerability. But there was something even more strategic in how they used it. Distance allowed them to gather knowledge. Every journey was not just movement, it was observation. They learned coastlines, river systems, settlements, and patterns of life. Over time, these distant places became familiar to them. Even if the people living there had never imagined being seen, they knew where to land, they knew when to strike, they knew how to leave, and that knowledge turned distance into precision. What looked like randomness from the outside was often calculated from within, each route refined, each decision informed by experience, each journey building on the last. And as that knowledge expanded, so did their reach. This is how they extended beyond the known world, reaching places like North America long before others would even consider the possibility. Not as a single extraordinary event, but as a continuation of a mindset that refused to see limits where others accepted them. Distance did not slow them down. It empowered them. Because once you remove the fear of how far something is, you begin to operate without boundaries. You stop asking whether something is reachable and start asking how to get there. And in doing so, you enter a space where very few can follow. This is why they could strike where no one expected. This is why they could disappear beyond pursuit. And this is why the world began to feel smaller. Not because it changed, but because the Vikings learned how to move through it without restriction. The warrior who feared nothing. Every army carries fear into battle. It may be hidden, controlled, or denied, but it is always there. Fear of pain, fear of loss, fear of death. These fears shape decisions, slow movements, and create hesitation at the exact moment when clarity is needed most. Even the most disciplined warriors are influenced by it because fear is not weakness, it is human. The Vikings reshaped that equation. They did not eliminate fear completely, but they changed its meaning. At the center of their belief system was something that altered how they faced the end of life. The idea of Valhalla was not just a story. It was a destination, a place reserved for those who died in battle, chosen for their courage, welcomed not as victims, but as honored warriors. This belief did something profound. It transformed death from an outcome to avoid into a path to achieve. Imagine stepping into a fight where the worst possible result is no longer something you fear, but something you accept, even pursue. That shift changes everything. It removes hesitation. It removes the instinct to retreat. It replaces survival with purpose. Because now the question is no longer how to stay alive, it is how to die well. This created a mindset that felt almost impossible to confront. Opponents were used to breaking their enemies through pressure, through fear, through the threat of death. But what happens when that threat loses its power? When the person in front of you does not respond the way you expect, your strategies begin to fail, your assumptions begin to collapse, because fear is one of the most reliable tools in conflict. It controls behavior, influences decisions, and often determines outcomes before the first strike. Remove or reshape that fear, and you remove one of the strongest advantages an enemy can use against you. The Vikings did not just fight with weapons, they fought with belief, and belief is harder to defeat than steel. This does not mean they were reckless. It means they were committed. Their actions were not random bursts of aggression, but expressions of a deeper conviction. They moved forward with a sense of inevitability, as if the outcome had already been decided. That certainty created pressure, and that pressure forced mistakes. Because when one side is calculating risk, and the other is embracing it, the balance shifts. The side that hesitates becomes predictable. The side that commits becomes dominant. Over time, this difference becomes visible in every encounter. The Vikings pressed forward when others would pull back. They engaged when others would wait. They accepted consequences that others were trying to avoid, and in doing so, they gained control over the most important element of battle: momentum. Because once fear stops slowing you down, nothing else can take its place quickly enough. Decisions become faster, actions become sharper, movement becomes continuous, and against an enemy that still carries doubt, that speed becomes overwhelming. This is why they felt unstoppable, not because they could not be defeated, but because defeating them required something more than strength. It required breaking a mindset that had already accepted every possible outcome. And that is far more difficult than winning a fight. Because you are no longer just facing a warrior. You are facing someone who has already made peace with the end and chosen to move forward anyway. More than raiders, masters of transformation. If the Vikings had only destroyed, they would have been remembered as a passing storm. Violent, sudden, and temporary. But that is not what happened. What made them truly dangerous was not just their ability to attack, but their ability to change. To shift roles depending on the situation, adapting faster than the world around them could understand. One moment, they were raiders. The next, they were traders. And in time, they became settlers, integrating into lands they once struck without warning. This was not contradiction. It was strategy. Most societies separated these roles. Warriors fought, merchants traded, farmers settled. Each identity had its place, its structure, its limitations. The Vikings moved between these identities fluidly, without restriction, and that flexibility gave them an advantage that went far beyond combat. Because when you can transform, you can survive in more environments. And when you can survive in more environments, you can expand. After a raid, they did not always leave destruction behind. Sometimes they returned, not with weapons raised, but with goods to exchange. Silver, furs, crafted items, knowledge. What had once been a place of fear could become a place of opportunity. And over time, relationships formed, not out of trust at first, but out of necessity. Trade opened doors that violence alone could not. And once those doors were open, settlement became possible. They began to establish themselves in foreign lands, not as temporary invaders, but as permanent presences. They learned local customs, adapted to new conditions, and blended their identity with the regions they entered. This was not assimilation in the traditional sense. It was expansion through transformation. They did not need to remain outsiders. They could become part of the world they once disrupted. This created a deeper level of influence, because now they were not just appearing and disappearing. They were staying, building, growing. extending their reach not through constant conflict, but through continuity. And that continuity made them harder to remove. An enemy can be fought. A presence must be managed. Over time, this blurred the lines between threat and integration. The same people who once arrived as attackers could later be found as traders in markets, as settlers on land, as part of the local structure itself. And this created a kind of strategic complexity that few others could match. Because how do you define an enemy that no longer looks like one? How do you resist something that has already become part of your world? This is where their power evolved. They were no longer just a force that disrupted from the outside. They became a force that could operate from within, and that duality made them far more difficult to control. They could choose how to engage based on what benefited them most in that moment. If resistance was strong, they could trade. If opportunity appeared, they could settle. If weakness was exposed, they could strike. Always adapting, always shifting, always moving between roles in a way that kept others off balance. This is why they lasted, not because they were the most aggressive, but because they were the most flexible. They did not rely on a single way of interacting with the world. They evolved with it, adjusted to it, and in many ways reshaped it around them. And in doing so, they became more than warriors. They became something far more difficult to define and far more difficult to stop. The moment fear became their reputation. There is a point in every conflict where reality stops mattering as much as perception. For the Vikings, that moment came when their actions began to travel faster than they did. At first, they were an unknown threat, sudden, violent, confusing. But over time, something changed. Stories began to spread. Not carefully documented accounts, but emotional retellings shaped by shock, fear, and the need to explain what felt impossible to understand. And those stories did not stay small. They moved from village to village, from coast to inland, from witness to listener. Each time they were told, something subtle happened. Details sharpened, emotions intensified. The unknown filled in the gaps. What was once an event became a warning, then a legend. Because when people do not fully understand something, they do not describe it accurately. They amplify it. A fast attack becomes unstoppable. A skilled fighter becomes invincible. A successful raid becomes a force that cannot be resisted. Over time, the Vikings stopped being seen as men. They became something else, a symbol. And symbols are far more powerful than individuals, because you cannot measure them. You cannot predict them. You cannot contain them within the limits of reality. A symbol grows in the imagination, shaped not just by what happened, but by what people believe could happen next. This is when fear changes form. It stops reacting to events and starts anticipating them. Now imagine living in a world where every distant sail might belong to them, where every unfamiliar movement near the coast carries the weight of every story you have ever heard. The mind does not wait for confirmation. It fills in the conclusion immediately. They are here, even when they are not. This is the moment where fear becomes self-sustaining, because once that belief takes hold, it begins to influence behavior. Villages prepare for attacks that have not happened. Communities abandon areas that might never be targeted. Defenses are built not based on strategy, but on anxiety. And in that environment, the Vikings no longer need to be everywhere. The idea of them is enough. This gave them an advantage that no army could replicate. They could control regions without physically occupying them. They could disrupt stability without launching a single attack, because the expectation of their presence was already doing the work. And when they did arrive, the outcome was often decided before the first strike. Not because they were stronger, but because their enemies were already weakened. Fear had taken hold. Confidence had eroded. Resistance had been replaced by anticipation of loss. This is how reputation becomes a weapon. Not through deliberate design, but through accumulation. each action adding to a growing image that eventually becomes larger than the reality itself. And once that image is established, it begins to act independently. It shapes decisions. It alters perception. It spreads without effort. The Vikings reached that point. They became known before they were seen, and once that happened, something irreversible took place. They no longer needed to prove how dangerous they were. The world had already decided. The real reason they were unstoppable. At this point, it is tempting to search for a single answer, a superior weapon, a unique strategy, a moment in history where everything aligned in their favor. But that answer does not exist, because the true power of the Vikings was never one thing. It was the way everything came together. A world that believed in predictable war, met an enemy that rejected predictability, a society shaped by stability, encountered a culture forged in constant hardship, systems built on time and preparation, faced a force that moved faster than thought itself. Nothing about this collision was equal, and that imbalance is where their dominance was born. They did not rely on strength alone. They combined speed, unpredictability, and adaptability into a system that functioned without needing permission from the rules everyone else followed. While others defended territory, they controlled movement. While others feared loss, they redefined it. While others reacted, they decided. And once that pattern repeated enough times, it created something far more powerful than victory. It created inevitability. Because when an enemy consistently arrives without warning, strikes without hesitation, and disappears without consequence, the mind begins to adjust, not to resist, but to expect defeat. And once that expectation takes hold, resistance weakens before it even begins. This is where their true strength revealed itself, not in the moment of impact, but in everything that happened before it. The fear that spread ahead of them, the uncertainty that followed them, the psychological weight they left behind. These were not side effects. They were extensions of how they operated. Every raid, every movement, every decision contributed to a growing presence that could not be easily defined or contained. They were not just fighting battles. They were reshaping how people experienced conflict. And when you change perception, you change outcomes. Because the greatest advantage in any struggle is not physical dominance. It is control over how the other side thinks, reacts, and decides. The Vikings achieved that. They forced the world to question its assumptions, to doubt its defenses, to confront a reality where the old rules no longer applied. And in that moment of uncertainty, they moved with clarity, with purpose, with a level of control that others could not match. That is why they felt unstoppable, not because they could never be defeated, but because defeating them required something more than strength. It required a complete shift in thinking, a willingness to abandon old patterns and adapt to something entirely new. And that kind of change does not happen quickly. It takes time. Time the Vikings never gave. So they continued to move, to strike, to adapt, to evolve. Always one step ahead of a world still trying to understand what it was facing. And by the time that understanding finally began to form, their legacy was already complete. They had done something no army had done before. They did not just win battles, they changed the meaning of fear itself.